This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I am your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other fascinating things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Anshel Pfeffer. He is a longtime journalist at Haaretz and The Economist. He has just published the book that everybody is waiting to read called Netanyahu Unbound. Just kidding. It's not actually called that. It's called Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, published by Basic Books. And he asks the age-old question, what makes Bibi tick and what makes Israeli society's heart beat for Bibi? Anshel Pfeffer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dalia. Hi, Gilad.
I want to start with plunging right into a moment that you mention in the book where you walk into Netanyahu's office with some of your Economist colleagues and he says something to the effect of, this is Mr. Pfeffer, he's writing his biography, but he knows nothing about me. What does this little anecdote say about Netanyahu and how he approaches the people who try to learn about him and characterize him? Is he trying to just control always how we think about him?
Yes.
So please expand.
Netanyahu has a very exaggerated sense of his place in history. Now, obviously, he has a place in history. He's been the leader of Israel for 12 years. So he's a historic figure. But his expectation that he will be the one to define how history, from the first draft of history, which is journalism, to the future books and research which will be written about him, and the memoirs that he plans himself to write, he wants to be the man to define all that. He wants to decide how it will be seen, how it will be written. So the very idea that someone is writing a book about him, and even if the book is not so critical, we haven't seen him encouraging biographers who are more supportive of him either. He doesn't want someone to write a book about him. He wants, as he said recently, in many years from now to write his memoirs. He wants to sign a check, get a multi-million advance from some big American publisher and then spend a couple of years writing it, just in the same way that US presidents do it when their presidency is over. He doesn't want anyone butting in there and setting the record on him. And it's the same thing with journalism, as I said. One of the questions people are asking about the investigations 2000 and 4000, where Netanyahu is in deep trouble because he tried to get media publishers with Yot HaChronot unsuccessfully, with Walla successfully, to report him and cover him in a very favorable way. Why did he need to do that? He's won 4 elections, despite the Israeli media being, by and large, not on his side. And he still tries again and again and again to do everything. He tries to get billionaires to buy the Israeli newspapers and news channels. In one case, he got one to set up a whole newspaper for him. It's never enough. He always needs to have blanket coverage in his favor.
But this very quality might be his downfall in the end, is what you're saying.
I wrote that I think that could be, in the end, be what will lead to his downfall. He has this incredible need to convince everyone, which is why he's the ultimate Masbiran. His Hasbara doesn't start with the American audiences. That maybe is where he most excels, but his Hasbara starts with every person he meets and every Israeli on the street. He needs them all to be convinced.
Just explain what you mean by Masbiran for our listeners. You mean a derivative of Hasbara, Israeli propaganda.
If there's any of our listeners who don't know what Hasbara means, literally it means to explain. And Netanyahu didn't invent it, and it was around long before Likud came into power. But the ideology of, not just of Netanyahu, but of Likud and before that of the revisionist movement of Jabotinsky was that it's not just a means to an end, but Hasbara is in itself a core part of what the ideology has to be about.
And as Netanyahu's biographer, I'd like to ask you on this. So how
unauthorized biographer.
Unauthorized biographer, but still a biographer.
But are there any authorized biographies?
Yeah. No,
not yet. Only himself.
There won't be, yeah. How difficult was it to write this book without the cooperation and even the overt hostility of the main protagonist?
Well, there's no lack of information. There's no lack of people to speak to. probably enough people to speak to who have worked with Netanyahu and have known him from up close to write five...
You didn't feel it impeded you in any way?
Well, I'll get to that in a second, but one of the biggest problems in writing a biography of a public figure like Netanyahu, who's had such a long public career, has been involved in so many things for over 3 decades, and has a very interesting family story, childhood going back before he became a public figure, is that at the end of the day, a publisher wants a book which is a manageable size to print and to sell, which is usually around 400 pages, if you're lucky. So there's a wealth of information, there's a wealth of, just because Israeli journalism has done such an incredible job, and one of the things you discover when you work on a book like this is just how good the Israeli media is. We, the Israeli journalists, haven't let Netanyahu, we haven't given him an hour's piece, and we've delved into every dark corner we could. But at the end of the day, yes, there's a problem here because you can't get to speak to the man himself. And even if, I did have meetings with him in other circumstances. Dalia mentioned one circumstance when I met with him for 2 hours with the Economist editors, and there was 2 or 3 other similar circumstances in which I sat down with Netanyahu over the 3 years in which I was working on the book. Netanyahu is one of those politicians, the distance between what they say on the record and what they talk with you off the record when you're sitting down, and it's all, nothing can be quoted, nothing can be said. There is very, very little distance. And most politicians, the man or the woman you meet in an interview on the television and the man, the woman you meet inside a closed room when you sit down and everyone's more relaxed, there's usually a wide distance. It's usually a very different person. Whereas Netanyahu is almost exactly the same person off the record and on the record. So even if he had given me dozens of meetings, like some politicians do with their biographers, I'm not sure how it would have been that useful.
Mm-hmm. So he is the hasbara that he has.
I think he believes what he says.
Yeah.
In most cases, obviously there are some cases where he makes various pragmatic and compromises in what he says. He makes allowances for PR. But by and large, Netanyahu is the person inside a closed room, and on the screen he's the same person. He believes in his...
The striking thing about this book, among many other things, is that the fact that it was published now in 2018, some 35 odd years after Netanyahu first became a public figure, more than 20 years after he was first elected prime minister, and it's virtually the first comprehensive biography to be published about him. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, there were 2 written in Hebrew in 1997, shortly after he became prime minister. One of those was translated into English. There's been a couple over the last few years. So at the most, there's half a dozen biographies of him. I think it's a very incomplete bookshelf. I think my book in itself, because it's just 400 pages, because that's the kind of book that sells today, there's still a lot to be said. There's a lot. I could have written a book twice this length. I had enough stuff. And there's a different way you write this book for an international audience,
sure.
A different way you write for an Israeli audience. But I think there'll be an incredible book to be written 30, 40 years from now, when the archives hopefully will be open, and letters and records, which I don't have the access to, and I tried, but pretty almost impossible. But there are only a few people who won't talk today, or maybe have talked by then. But there is a massive biography to be written, and whatever
sure.
you think of him, there will be a lot to be said, and it is the defining figure of the second half of Israel's existence.
Absolutely, but why did you write it now and not before? I mean, when did the idea come to you?
Wait, can I expand on that question?
Sure.
Because I want to know if you wrote this book because you see Bibi as really an emerging historic figure who's changing Israel and is going to go down in the history books, or if you have this kind of, like, you and Bibi in a kind of journalist political dance because you've been covering Israeli politics for so long, and him. And does this become personal at a certain point? And did it kind of just feel ripe within you to write this now?
Well, I think I'll start from the second option you offered me. I think it's personal for everyone. He's the man who has defined the last 30 years here in Israel. There was a decade in which he was the head of opposition and then prime minister for a short while. Then we thought for 10 years that we've got rid of him, and we had Barak and Sharon and Omar. But he was always lurking to come back. It was very clear. And then for the last decade, we've had him again. So he's defined our lives as Israelis, as journalists, as people who care about what's happening in this country. He's very much defined, in many ways, the relationship between Jews outside Israel and with Israel. And from that point of view, it is very personal. And I think every conversation that we have with fellow Israelis or with Jews, or with people who maybe not even Jewish or Israeli but care about Israel or are exercised by what happens in this part of the world, it's very visceral. No one is in Britain. They would call it a Marmite politician. You either hate him or love him, and you hate him or love him with a passion. So there's that. The other question of why to write it now and whether this, like you said, Dalia, an emerging figure in history. There's no question that someone who's about to equal, assuming he holds on for another 14 months, and I think he probably will, equal David Ben-Gurion's record of time as Prime Minister, is a historical figure. Whether or not we can link to him pivotal moments in Israeli history, and I argue that we can't, because nothing pivotal happened in his periods as Prime Minister. But that in itself is also stasis and status quo is a historical state. So there are no big wars that we can mention that happened during Netanyahu's
just
period.
Little ones.
Just one little one, and actually
2. Gaza twice, pillar of defense and protective
Pillar of
edge.
defense was 6 days, ended very quickly with Morsi, with the Muslim Brotherhood mediation. And yes, the second one. But if you spread Netanyahu's time, and the very last footnote in my book is quotes data analysis that I commissioned. If you take an average year of Netanyahu, it's not just marginally smaller, but majorly lower casualty numbers. Now, I couldn't find the same numbers for the Palestinian and the Arab side, but I think we can assume that if less Israelis were getting killed, then also less Palestinians were getting killed, because usually when the tension goes up, people are getting killed on both sides.
But the flip side of what you said about him emerging as this historic figure is that before people thought of him as some sort of temporary or maybe unremarkable political phenomenon during his 10 years in opposition, in between his premierships and even in his first or maybe 2 first terms as prime ministers. He wasn't quite King Bibi yet, or the historical figure in Israel's history.
Well, there's always been 2 tendencies. One, when it comes to Netanyahu himself, to see him as an aberration, some kind of foreign transplant from the United States grafted onto the Israeli body politic, someone who came here by mistake, and the moment he's gone, he'll be gone very soon, and it's something that's just happened by mistake and will come to our senses. The other thing, that their tendency is to see Israel's history and Israel's politics from the perspective of the founding generation of Ben-Gurion and Golda and Dayan and the Mapai leadership, and afterwards of Peres and Rabin, as if that is the way Israel should be seen. But we're now 70 years old, this state is 70 years old. The Likud have finally equaled the time of Mapai in power, of Mapai Labour. Likud Cherut, those 2 big political camps have now equal time and power, with Kadima 3 years just behind in second. And
it's debatable how different that really was, because of course they're an offshoot.
So it's true that if you take the history of the Zionist movement before 1948, then already from the early 30s, the Labour was to become Labour, or socialist Zionism was already the dominant stream, and the revisionism and right wing was never really dominant even before the socialists became more powerful in the Zionist movement. But if you just take this unit of time, 70 years, we now have half of that time, and the second half in which we are now, which we're now ending, has been dominated by Likud, by the revisionist movement. So to see Israeli history through the eyes of Ben-Gurion and Golda is just seeing it from one side. But yet we still see so much journalism and research and books being written from that perspective. So I think these are 2 things that have to be changed. First of all, we have to see a much wider story of Israel through the eyes of those who were the underdogs, who were the outsiders of the establishment, but for the last 40 years have been in power most of the time. And we have to admit that Netanyahu is not an aberration. He is Israel. He is someone who represents his country in many ways. We may not like him, we may be embarrassed by him, we may even hate him, but he is part and parcel of what this country is. It's not a coincidence that he's not a UFO who suddenly arrived and become stuck in the Prime Minister's office for 12 years now.
Well, I want to ask a question about exactly what you raised. I think you have basically a thesis in the book, is that he came to power originally on some sort of a coalition of people who felt themselves to be underdogs in Israeli society in the 1990s. And he wasn't so successful in the first term, but in the second term that he came back in 2009, he essentially rallied also a coalition of the underdogs, people who felt they had been left out by that founding generation. But as you very well pointed out, the time is almost evenly broken down now between the original founding labor leadership and the other side, the Likud side, in some form, since statehood. At what point do underdogs stop being underdogs? Our listeners cannot see this, but you are smiling. Why are you smiling?
Because that's the genius of Netanyahu. The political genius of Netanyahu is that he allows this seething mass of underdogs, who are the majority, who have been in power now, like you said, for half of the time, at the same time as Labour has been in power, and more recently than Labour, more important, they are the establishment, they are the ruling elite. He allows them to still feel underdogs, still feel the bitterness and the resentment that they felt with a lot of justification until 1977, when Menachem Begin came to power. Now, Bibi's genius as a politician is that, and that he's a coalition builder. Now, usually when we say coalition builder, we mean someone who brings people together, makes everyone feel good about themselves, smooths the cracks, and manages to create a feeling of togetherness. Netanyahu is a coalition builder in the opposite sense. He manages to build a coalition where everyone constantly feels they're being screwed over.
A with us or against us coalition.
It's not just a with us or against us, it's that those who we are against are actually still in power. Even though we are the government, even though we've been elected, we're not yet in power. This has always been the criticism that Netanyahu and other right-wingers have had of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin came to power in 1977. He was a coalition builder. He built this coalition between the nationalist right wing and the Mizrahim and the religious. This was a very strong coalition that Begin built in 77. But Begin did not want those who had just lost power in 77, the old establishment, to feel that they were now going to be like the Cherutniks had been for almost 30 years, that they couldn't get the top jobs, they couldn't get budgets, they couldn't be part of the establishment. He made it very clear that he's not going to fire any of the senior officials that he inherited from Rabin in 77. He didn't fire the ambassador to the US, he didn't fire his senior advisors. Yes, of course, he appointed some Likudniks, but he tried to create this, and we saw it also in his attitude to the Supreme Court. He didn't want to create a feeling of we're going to now replace the elites. He wanted a feeling that everyone can be part of the elite. The opposition, the coalition, right, left, secular and religious, Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. Bibi has done the opposite of what Begin. He has the same coalition of Begin, but he's keeping it together in a much more effective and devastatingly effective way, in which you will always feel as if you're on the outside. And this is where he's like Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is the son of a millionaire, a man who's never known any kind of poverty in his life, and yet he resonates with the bitter people, blue-collar voters, white voters who feel disenfranchised by the changing world. And Netanyahu's done the same thing. He's a son of, he was not son of a millionaire, but he's a son of a very elite professor. He lived a very comfortable middle-class life.
But a professor who felt like an underdog, and we have to go to the father and the sense of being an underdog.
I just want to stay on that for just one more second. It's worked for him very well. This strategy has worked for him very well over the last few years, certainly in this decade, but it failed miserably in the last decade. I mean, Netanyahu led Likud to the two most devastating defeats in Likud's history, 1999 and 2006. And of course, that was his political card back then, also this coalition of the disenfranchised. Why do you think it failed then and it works so well now?
Well, there are a number of things that appeal to voters. There's one thing that you want to feel part of a group which is standing up for your interests, and that works very well for Netanyahu. The other thing that is important for Israeli voters is to vote for security, to vote for someone who seems strong. Now, it doesn't always go according to the right wing. Israelis vote for whoever seems, not all Israelis, but a lot of Israelis vote for whoever seems to be the strong and stable leader. So we've seen examples where that helped the left. In 1974, despite everything that happened to Yom Kippur War, they still voted for Golda and Dayan and Mapai because they still felt that Begin and Likud weren't ready yet to take power. And perhaps even because of the trauma of 1973 and Yom Kippur War, they voted for the left. The same thing happened in 1992. They voted for Rabin. They went slightly to the left, even though Rabin had to make himself very much a centrist then, but they turned away from Yitzhak Shamir and voted for Rabin because there were the stabbings, there was a feeling of lack of security. They looked to the person who gave them a better impression of someone who can be the strong and secure leader. Israelis vote for strong and secure, not for left or right. And right now, Netanyahu does not have the alternative.
It's just because there's no competition.
But when the alternative to him was someone like Sharon or someone like Barak, then they went for the older and more experienced and stronger leader, even though that leader was to the left of Netanyahu.
I think we have to back up and think about these roots that you mentioned, because really I wanted to ask about your exploration of Ben-Zion Netanyahu, his father, but you raise a very good point that it ties into many very interesting similarities that I think come out of your book to Donald Trump. So I was going to ask them separately, but since you bring them together, can we think about it for a minute? Why, on the one hand, Ben-Zion Netanyahu is a figure who you say was a very elite professor, but also himself, you argue,
he felt he was an elite professor.
But he also felt like an outsider. And he felt like, or you portray him as a political failure.
Well,
Does the underdog sense that Bibi has come from this deep-rooted personal psychology of having to avenge the outsiderness of his father?
I think in part, yes. I think at some stage even Netanyahu was trying to get away from his father because his father to him symbolized failure. And we see both Yoni, Bibi's elder brother, and Bibi himself rebelling against their father at the age of 18, not staying with their family in the US because Bibi's father and mother had taken them to the US in the early 60s because he couldn't get what he wanted, which was a job as a professor at the Hebrew University. He could make a living because he was the editor of the Encyclopedia Hebraica, which was a very successful commercial venture, and he was the editor-in-chief, and he made a lot of money out of that. But he wanted more. He wanted the recognition. He wanted academic recognition. He didn't want just to be editing other professors. He wanted to be a professor himself, which is why he went to the US, where there was much more opportunities for him to get that kind of recognition. And he felt that Yoni and Bibi should stay at the age of 18, when they finished high school in Philadelphia, go on to Ivy League universities. Yoni was accepted to Harvard, Bibi was accepted to Yale, and both of them said, no, we're going back to the IDF, and we're going to join up the army on our own. We're going to go to the most demanding military units, and we're going to serve as officers, so we're going to stay even longer. We're going to defer our education for more years. And that was a rebellion against Ben-Zion. Afterwards, the family made a myth that obviously the sons were going to go back to join the army. At the time, it was expressly against his wishes. He wanted them. He didn't see military service. He was a Zionist, but he didn't see military service as being something that his sons, who were the intellectual elite, need to do. They should spend their years studying and then perhaps be diplomats or writers or ideologues or leaders on a political and intellectual level. Going to the army wasn't something that clever boys like his own sons had. He didn't understand at the time how the IDF was seen by his son's generation. So, yes, there was that feeling that their father was the outsider and they have to avenge it, but they also Bibi wanted to get away from that failure. Now, Bibi is very different from Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a man who doesn't read books, who's a man who doesn't think deeply about anything. He's ignorant about most things. While Netanyahu is a deep thinker, he's a voracious reader of history. He, like I said before, he has an exaggerated sense of his own place in history, but he thinks in historical terms, and he thinks about Israel's destiny, of his own personal destiny, in arcs of thousands of years. He thinks about how not to make the mistake that the leaders of the Maccabean kingdom in the period of the Second Temple 2,000 years ago, how not to make the same mistakes which led to the destruction and the loss of sovereignty, the last Jewish sovereignty before the state of Israel in this land.
And we all know he reads Barbara Tuchman because he held the book up in Knesset to show everybody that he's reading the March of Folly and how not to make those mistakes. But there are similarities that exist. I mean, some of them are very specific. You don't even mention them, but they arise from your anecdotes.
So one is, as I said before, the fact that both of them, despite them not being from poor backgrounds, managed to resonate with people who have been in the past disenfranchised, people who do have justified, at least their parents had justified bitterness, and to latch on to those feelings of resentment. And it's almost metaphysical the way they do it. And the other thing they latched on to is the fear of losing out, the fear of someone coming in, foreigners, immigrants, Arabs in Israeli case, Mexicans in Trump's case, coming in and taking away these hard-earned statehood benefits that we have. So in that sense, Netanyahu and Trump are very, very similar. And the fact that they don't really tend to be introspective, they don't have any self-criticism.
But I was thinking of a fear, exactly. I was thinking of a fear on a psychological level that they seem to share. The fear of criticism. You say that Netanyahu is impervious to criticism. Fear that people won't be loyal to them. You show Netanyahu asking a potential head of the Mossad that he's interviewing, saying, will you be loyal to me? I mean, we've heard this verbatim from Trump. Is there a sense of their similar personal psychology and a fear that they won't be loved enough and they won't be lauded enough?
I tried very much in the book not to put Netanyahu on the psychological, on the shrink's couch. I don't think that that's something that any of us have enough material to do it. But like you say, these things emerge from the anecdotes and are almost, we can't get away from it. So yes, there are these very similar traits. And we can see the way both these men take to each other in such a... To me, it's almost strange because I know how much Netanyahu appreciates intellectualism and he appreciates people, appreciates thinkers, and he does like speaking to people on those levels. He obviously doesn't have those kind of conversations with Donald Trump, but he has another kind of connection with Trump, which you're right, there's a lot of similarity
One
there.
more small point on that. I think I wasn't trying to psychoanalyze them so much as look at the common aspects of their personality that lead them to policies that are illiberal. The attempt to control the narrative and the press and the dismissal of checks and balances in society. That's what I'm getting at.
Well, I think we're seeing here a tendency, not just Netanyahu and Trump, we're seeing a great tendency in lots of leaders in even democratic countries. We're seeing it from India to Hungary to the Philippines to Japan. We're seeing more and more illiberal Democrats, people who will say, well, I have a mandate because I was voted democratically and now I can erode various civil rights and
Do you think that in
freedom of
this
press and so
sense
on.
Bibi jumped on the bandwagon? Was he more resolutely democratic or more liberal in the earlier chapters of his career?
I think Netanyahu was more liberal early in his career because he didn't feel as powerful as he feels now. But in the sense that now he said there's a bandwagon, I think Netanyahu was riding the bandwagon, or was it? Was the main? It was driving the bandwagon before some of these people came along. Certainly before Trump came along, before Viktor Orban came along, and every society has different circumstances. It's difficult to compare, but perhaps Netanyahu feels more comfortable saying things now he wouldn't have said in the past. And perhaps he feels now more under threat because of the investigations that he has to say these things. I don't think Netanyahu has an ideology saying we should erode civil liberties. I don't think that was, if you read what Netanyahu's written over the years, stuff he said, I believe what Netanyahu writes. Read his book from 25 years ago, Place Among the Nations. It's what he set out his plan and he's done it ever since. So I don't think Netanyahu thought, well, I have to take away the right of the press to do certain things. But over the years, he felt so frustrated at the fact that we don't all prostrate ourselves in front of him and say how wonderful he is. I mean, he said to Ilyana Dayan, with all seriousness, 2 years ago in a meeting that he had with some of the Channel 2, then it was Channel 2, journalists, and said to them, why don't you do an investigative program about how much I'm admired and loved abroad? And he meant it. He wasn't a joke. He really believes that we in the press are subverting our own mission by not saying how wonderful he is. And one of his defenses, if he is indicted in case 2004, will be to say that for Walla to cover me favorably and for me to expect Ynet and Yediot Ahronoth to cover me favorably is in no way bribery. I should be covered favorably because I'm such a wonderful prime minister.
I want to go back to Yoni, his elder brother that you mentioned earlier, and is, of course, a recurrent character in the book and as well as in Bibi's life. And my question to you is, to what extent do you think that Bibi owes his career, his political career, to Yoni, sadly, to Yoni's death? Because you do write that people started noticing him, Bibi, only after he organized the first international conference of the Jonathan Institute that was set up in memory of Yoni, who had been killed during the Entebbe raid that he commanded 3 years before. He was killed in 1976 and the conference was 1979. The job offers started pouring in only after that conference, and before that, he was a divorced, unemployed 30-year-old living with his parents.
Well, there's no question that the way and the timing of Yoni's death and the fact that since no other officer who had been on the operation could be revealed at the time because they were all IEF pilots or Sayeret Matkal commanders. So the glory went to Yoni because Yoni, in his death, became the face of the operation. But Yoni was dead, so he couldn't actually be the face. Someone had to fill in, and Bibi was there because he was no longer serving as an officer. But he had been in Sayeret Matkal. He was Yoni's brother. He was so close to Yoni. It was natural for him to become the torchbearer, and that was an incredible jump start in any political career at such a young age, suddenly being pushed forward into the limelight at 27, the brother of the big hero. And Israel has lost 24,000 soldiers over 70 years. Yoni's got more recognition because of the Netanyahu family making such a big fuss out of him, but also because Entebbe came less than 3 years after Yom Kippur. It was the biggest Israeli trouble was losing trust in the IDF in Yom Kippur War. Along came the Entebbe operation to restore Israelis' faith in and it was an incredible operation, and Yoni personified it, and Bibi had this opportunity. And Bibi himself said many times that before Yoni died, I never thought of going into politics, and I would never have done it, etc. But if you look at Netanyahu's trajectory earlier already, the way he was already being very ambitious in his pro-Israel activism on campus at MIT and in other parts of New England, he was already going around to synagogues and Jewish federations to give talks on Israel, and he was already doing his first media appearances. He was already in it. It was going to happen. It's a big what if of Israeli history. If he only hadn't been killed,
but it did
would have
nothing
happened?
to mitigate his inferiority complex as an outsider. The fact that his brother was this national
No,
hero.
quite the opposite. The Netanyahu family were, within weeks after Entebbe, were already feeling that other people were trying to take some of Yoni's glory away. And their biggest supporter at the time was Shimon Peres, because Shimon Peres wanted to appear as one of the major figures at Entebbe. But Rabin, the prime minister, who hated Peres, his defense minister, was doing everything to push Shimon Peres out of the margin. And Peres deserved some credit, though at the end of the day it was Rabin as prime minister who had to make the tough decisions. So Peres invented the myth of Yoni Netanyahu. Before the Netanyahu family did it, Shimon Peres was there. Shimon Peres invented a whole meeting that he had the night before with Yoni.
actually making stuff up.
It totally made stuff. Yes, there had been a meeting, but it wasn't Yoni. It was Muki Betza, one of Yoni's deputies, who had briefed him. But he made up a whole story about how he knew the family. He had not known the family at all. But he built the Yoni myth so he could somehow be close to the center of the action. And that was the best thing that happened to Shimon Peres. Was the best thing that ever happened to jumpstart Bibi's career.
But I have to say that, apropos Gilad's question, I'm not convinced of the Yoni made Bibi myth. In other words, I think the qualities he shows and that come out in your book are that he's a driven person with a certain set of skills, including his gift of gab, or you can call it hasbara, or his communicativeness, and his famous personality. You know, he's a charmer. It seems to me from this that he would have somehow put himself in the public limelight to begin with.
I agree. It may have taken him a few more years because he was pushed forward at a very early age. He may have not been a candidate to the kind of jobs he had in the early 30s. You know, he became the ambassador to the UN at the age of 34, which is unthinkable today. And it was unthinkable then. It didn't make sense. Lots of people, once again, Shimon Peres said, hey, this guy, I know him. He's from the Netanyahu family.
And Coletta Vital.
Coletta Vital was also part of his earliest fan club. So he had his jump start. But I think he would have been a very ambitious and relatively young senior politician, whether or not he came at the right time. He came when Israelis were looking for someone more polished, more accomplished, someone who could fit the television era. Bibi's timing was perfect.
I think we have to ask a final question, or close to final question, because we cannot have this conversation without discussing corruption. This is the big question going on in Israel today, and because we have no answers yet, I want to go back to the 1990s. I had to be reminded of how many times he was investigated in different kinds of corruption scandals, from the Bar-On affair and the contractors of his house, including recommendations of indictment then too. So which is it? Is he a habitually corrupt politician, or, as the right would claim, and many of his supporters, is this evil press and left-wing witch hunt against him that just proves how people have been trying to catch him for all these years and failed?
Well, since I come from a newspaper which revealed the corruption against Yitzhak Rabin's corruption, and Yitzhak Rabin was tainted by corruption, that we tend to see him as clean now. He took money that he shouldn't have taken in the 70s when he was ambassador, and that was the money that was lying around in Leah Rabin's bank account. So Haaretz uncovered that, and we uncovered Sharon. When Sharon was doing the disengagement, we still reported on his allegations, and when Olmert was already on the left by then, we reported that. So I don't think you can show that. Yes, I know there were some journalists on left and right who you can accuse of being ma'atregim, of trying to wrap in cotton wool the politicians they supported. But I think by and large, Israeli journalism has done a good job in uncovering corruption on the left and the right. Yes, the majority of Israeli journalists are not Netanyahu voters, but neither are the majority of Israelis. Netanyahu's never got more than, Likud under Bibi's never got more than 25%. So to say that we're somehow witch hunting against someone who we don't like and we're the minority, I think that's ridiculous. Netanyahu's corruption, and we mentioned it now, Sharon and Rabin and Olmert and various other corrupt prime ministers that we've had. Netanyahu has a feeling of entitlement, which is bolstered by his wife and other people, that since he's doing such a wonderful service to the state of Israel, and if he wasn't, he would be making billions of dollars in the private sector, he deserves all this champagne and jewelry and
to walk out of restaurants without paying.
And cigars without paying. And he deserves to get the best coverage possible. Until I'll see evidence, I don't think he's like Olmert, who was taking money in direct bribes. But I think this is corruption of another kind. I think it's just as bad. It's just more difficult to prove, which will always give his supporters grist to the mill that it's a witch hunt, but I think that it certainly is corruption, and I can't predict how it will come out in indictments and in court, but I think this will be his downfall.
And the sequel to this book.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Anshel, one last question because we are running out of time. What do you think would be his legacy? He's quoted as saying that when people asked him what he wanted to be remembered as, he said, as the guardian of Israel's security, which is such a bland thing to say. I mean, everyone in government, let alone a prime minister, would like to be remembered as that. And you did say that there isn't one single major event that he was the author of. What do you think would be his long-lasting legacy?
Well, it very much depends on what happens after he leaves, because Israel is at a fantastic period in its history. Israel has almost everything going for it right now. Every enemy and every rival that Israel had is so weak and so almost taken out of the game, and Israel has to sort of almost invent an enemy like Iran, which is far away. It's got so much of its own troubles. I'm not saying that Iran is not a threat or a bad player in the region. It is. Well, we shouldn't downplay how bad Iran is. We shouldn't exaggerate it as an existential threat either. The Palestinians are divided and weak and unpopular, and the world doesn't care about them anymore. With the exception of a few news organizations who still cover the Palestinian issue, really the world doesn't give a shit, about the Palestinians.
You're allowed to say that on the Tel Aviv Review.
No, but
when did we decide that?
I'm from Jerusalem. I have to be more cultured than you guys. But this is an incredible opportunity for Israel. Israel is now so strong and so prosperous. Israel is a regional power with GDP which equals that of most Western countries nowadays. If Israel wanted to now take the step forward and define its future for the next 70 years, this would be the time to do it. Trump, and I don't like Trump, is now the leader of an administration which will sign off on whatever Israel does. And the Europeans have got their own problems. They won't. No one's going to stop Israel from doing whatever it wants to do now. But Netanyahu doesn't want to fulfill the dreams of Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked and make and extend sovereignty to the West Bank. And he doesn't want to try and create some kind of historic compromise with the Palestinians. He wants to keep things the way they are. And perhaps we'll think in 20 years that was the right thing to do. And that was what helped us towards the next 20, 30, 40, 70 years. I think, and I'm sorry to say that, I think we'll see this as a squandered opportunity. We'll see this as a decade, this Netanyahu decade, we'll see this as a period in which Israel could have done what it tried to do in 93, 94 with Oslo, which was another period of prosperity after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now we have another period after the fall of the Arab world, basically. Arab world is in tatters. Arab radicalism exists, but it's localized and it's not a threat on Israel anymore. And we're in the same kind of period in which Rabin and Peres realized in 93, 94 that we can make these steps, but we don't have the leader who believes in those steps. And that will be the legacy of a squandered opportunity.
That's interesting, because we were going to ask as a last question, is he a visionary and a statesman or just a great politician? And it sounds like I know what your answer is.
No, I think he's a visionary, but is a very bleak one.
Or a static one in some way.
He sees holding strong, not compromising, not making concessions, not making any radical changes as strength. And he says he says it all the time, we need someone strong enough to withhold pressure. And he sees himself as that person, obviously.
Okay,
all right.
That's Anshel Pfeffer talking about his new biography of Bibi Netanyahu called Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, published by Basic Books. Anshel, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers. And now we have a small request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and then press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Also, you can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on to our Patreon campaign. We've got plenty of gifts for you. Check out our archive with some 450 interviews. If you like us, then you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.